The silence fell first, not with a whimper, but with the sudden, absolute cessation of all things. One moment, the glittering arterial network of intersystem commerce pulsed with life. Star-spanning vessels from colossal Vesper-class freighters, laden with processed Tellurian or two nimble courier pinnaces carrying encrypted data packets, coursing along the established hyperspace lanes. The next, the void was still. Every single trade conduit leading into or out of the Sol system, every established jump point, every charted warp corridor, simply vanished, not destroyed, not disrupted by some localized gravitic anomaly, but sealed. An impenetrable, shimmering barrier of hyperdensity energy, as impassive and final as the event horizon of a black hole, now ringed humanity's home. This was not a warning. It was a declaration. The architects of this cosmic quarantine were the K'tharr Hegemony, an ancient, sprawling empire of starfaring species that had long viewed humanity with a mix of detached curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. They considered our rapid expansion, our voracious consumption of nascent, stellar resources, and our audacious attempts to forge independent alliances within the galactic sphere as an affront to their meticulously ordered, millennial dominion. Their decree, delivered not through direct communication, but through the stark, undeniable reality of a universal blockade, was devastatingly clear. Humanity was to be isolated, punished, crippled. They intended to cut the very lifeblood of our burgeoning interstellar economy, to starve us of the exotic materials, the advanced cybernetic components, the vital atmospheric processors, and the specialized xenobiotics that fueled our off-world colonies and sustained our sprawling orbital habitats. The immediate fallout was not merely economic. It was existential. Imagine a trillion-strong metropolis suddenly severed from its food, its water, its power grids, its very air supply. That was the scale of the cataclysm. Terra stock markets, once the bedrock of galactic finance, imploded. With a speed that defied comprehension, billions of credits evaporated into nothingness. Interstellar corporations, their supply chains instantly severed, became hollow shells overnight. The colossal orbital foundries of Ganymede, dependent on imported Promethean alloys, ground to a halt. The biodomes of Kepler-186f, reliant on nutrient-paced shipments from the agri-worlds of the Cygnus arm, began to report critical shortages. The sleek, chrome-plated pleasure cruisers of the Jovian socialites, once fueled by refined helium-3, from distant gas giants drifted aimlessly, their power cells depleting. Panic, in the traditional sense, was curiously absent. Instead, a chilling collective dread settled over the human collective. We were not merely isolated, we were marooned. The K'tharr, with a cold, calculated precision that bespoke eons of galactic governance, had orchestrated a perfect economics strangulation. Their reasoning, we would later deduce, was simple. Humanity, a species notorious for its adaptability, its stubborn persistence, and its unsettling capacity for rapid technological advancement, was a threat to their established order. Best to nip us in the bud, before our chaotic approach to commerce and diplomacy could truly destabilize their rigid hierarchies. They saw our globalized, interconnected economic model as our greatest weakness, a fragile web of dependencies, easily snapped. And snap it, they did. The initial diplomatic overtures from the unified Terran alliance, broadcast on every known K'tharr frequency, were met with an echoing silence. Our orbital defense fleets, while formidable, were designed for localized threats, not to breach a hyperdimensional wall that spanned light-years. Attempts to probe the barrier with long-range sensor arrays yielded nothing but a perfect, featureless reflection. It was a prison without bars, a cage woven from the very fabric of space-time itself. The message was clear. You are on your own. You are inconsequential. You are forgotten, yet within that profound, suffocating silence, something else began to stir. Not despair, not surrender, but a different kind of hum. A low, resonant frequency of defiance. The human species, for all its flaws, had always possessed a peculiar genius for problem-solving when faced with insurmountable odds. We had clawed our way from a single world to a multi-system civilization, not through sheer strength, but through cunning adaptation and an unyielding refusal to accept defeat. The K'tharr Hegemony, in their arrogance, had failed to account for one critical variable. The human spirit, when cornered, does not break. It innovates, it transforms. It finds a better way, often in the most unexpected and inconvenient directions, for those who sought to constrain it. The stage was set, not for our demise, but for our greatest, most audacious act of economic rebellion. The initial frantic scramble for self-sufficiency slowly coalesced into a pragmatic, if austere, equilibrium. The unified Terran Alliance, through its newly empowered planetary resource allocation boards, had successfully orchestrated a massive internal reprioritization. The immediate threat of widespread famine or systemic collapse had been averted. Not by miracles, but by sheer, relentless human effort and a willingness to embrace radical changes. Communities that once relied on imported luxuries now found ingenuity in crafting their own. The concept of universal scarcity fostered an unprecedented level of inter-colony cooperation within the Sol system. Lunar helium-3 producers exchanged their surplus with Venusian atmospheric processors for filtered, breathable air, while Martian bioengineers shared their drought-resistant crop strains with the arid outposts of Ganymede. This new internal economy, dubbed the Saloop Network, was robust, if somewhat clunky. It was a barter system writ large, powered by the exchange of essential goods and localized expertise. The K'tharr Hegemony, through their distant, passive monitoring stations, would have noted the stabilization. They would have seen the internal energy grids humming again, the population movements settling, the desperate comes channels quietening. Perhaps they attributed it to humanity burning through its last reserves. A final, desperate flicker before the inevitable dimming. They were, as usual, profoundly mistaken. What they perceived as a species meekly accepting its fate was, in reality, a species meticulously recalibrating its internal compass, gathering strength for an act of defiance they couldn't possibly comprehend. For all its newfound resilience, the Saloop Network had its limitations. Humanity was self-sufficient, yes, but not optimally efficient. We still lacked access to certain exotic quantum-resonant materials critical for cutting-edge grav-drive research. We were missing specific crystalline structures essential for advanced biomedical applications. Our self-reliance was a shield, but it was also a cage. The K'tharr believed they had cornered us into a slow, grinding decline. But they had merely redirected our boundless ingenuity. If we couldn't send physical goods, what else could we send? What other form of value could be exchanged across the impossible barrier they had erected? The answer, as it often did with humanity, began with an anomaly. Dr. Eris Thorne, a theoretical xenoeconomist from the Tycho Institute, had been obsessively studying the K'tharr barrier's energy signature. He wasn't looking for a weakness to exploit, but for a fundamental principle to understand. His team discovered that while the barrier was impenetrable to matter and conventional energy fields, it did exhibit a peculiar, almost imperceptible, ripple when subjected to specific, hyperdense informational pulses. It was like shouting into a hurricane, but hearing a faint echo bounce back. The barrier was designed to block, not to erase, information in its purest, most abstract form might still possess a fleeting, ghost-like passage. This wasn't about sending a message. This was about sending value. What if, Thorne mused, the true currency of the universe wasn't physical goods, but information itself? Not blueprints or data packets, but abstract concepts, intellectual property, complex algorithms, or even the sheer computational power required to solve a galaxy-spanning problem. What if humanity could offer solutions, not just products? The K'tharr had quarantined our physical trade, but they couldn't quarantine our minds. The initial proposals were met with skepticism. You want to barter with ideas? Scoffed one Alliance admiral. But the economic planners, desperate for any leverage, saw the glimmer of a desperate hope. A top-secret project, codenamed Project Chimera, was launched. Its objective to devise a method of transmitting complex, high-value information across the K'tharr barrier, not as a desperate plea, but as an offer of abstract value, something that could be traded for something equally abstract on the other side. This was not about breaking the blockade. It was about bypassing it, using the very nature of information as a stealthy, undetectable medium of exchange. The K'tharr, still monitoring, would have seen the internal stability, the quiet determination. They might have even registered the increased activity around certain deep space research outposts, attributing it to a last-ditch effort to develop a counterweapon. They were so focused on our physical limitations, on the scarcity of our material resources, that they completely missed the subtle seismic shift in our strategic thinking. We were no longer fighting to regain access to their markets. We were building our own, in a dimension they hadn't even considered. We were about to turn their punishment into our most audacious economic advantage. The game was no longer about brute force or material wealth. It was about pure, unadulterated ingenuity. Project Chimera, born from Dr. Aris Thorne's audacious theories, was a monumental undertaking. Its premise was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. Transmit abstract value, not physical goods, across an interstellar blockade, designed to block everything but the most subtle informational echoes. The initial attempts were, predictably, failures. Vast energy expenditures produced nothing but garbled static on the other side, or worse, no detectable signal at all. The K'tharr barrier was not merely a wall. It was a filter, a distortion field, a cosmic noise generator. The challenge wasn't just power, but precision. It wasn't about shouting louder. It was about whispering in a specific frequency that the barrier in its very structure could not entirely suppress. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter, a reclusive team of quantum cryptographers from the Jovian belt, led by the enigmatic Dr. Lena Rostova. Her work, initially dismissed as esoteric theoretical physics, focused on the ephemeral nature of entangled data packets, information encoded not in traditional electromagnetic waves, but in the quantum states of exotic particles, then projected through a highly localized, Lacopa-scaved warp field. Rostova's hypothesis was radical. The K'tharr barrier, being a macroscopic phenomenon, might interact differently with quantum-entangled information. It was like trying to catch smoke with a net designed for boulders. While physical objects and classical energy fields were unequivocally blocked, these fleeting quantum states, intrinsically linked across vast distances, might bleed through, in a way that wasn't about overcoming the barrier's strength, but sidestepping its very design. They weren't pushing through it. They were finding the cracks in its conceptual framework. The first successful transmission was not a grand message, but a single, infinitesimally small data packet. It contained a complex mathematical proof, an elegant solution to a long-standing, galaxy-wide computational problem that had stumped even the most advanced K'tharr algorithms. The team called these transmissions echoes, faint, almost imperceptible whispers across the void. The power requirements were immense, the process excruciatingly slow, and the success rate initially abysmal. Yet, an echo did get through. Its reception, confirmed by passive hypersensor arrays positioned on the far side of the blockade, was the first true breach of the K'tharr's economic stranglehold. The K'tharr, with their vast, ancient network, of monitoring stations certainly registered the anomalous energy signatures emanating from the Sol system. They would have detected the peculiar, highly focused bursts of quantum coherent energy. Their analytical systems, however, were likely designed to identify weapons, fire, fleet movements, or conventional communications. The concept of information as currency transmitted through quantum entanglement was entirely outside their established threat parameters. They probably dismissed the echoes as random fluctuations, perhaps even as humanity's desperate, failed attempts at developing a superweapon or a barrier-breaching device. A species focused on physical dominance often overlooked the power of abstract thought. Humanity, however, understood its value implicitly. The transmitted mathematical proof was a gift, a demonstration of capability. It was the galactic equivalent of dropping a diamond on an alien doorstep. It was a subtle flex, a quiet boast of intellectual prowess. The next echoes were more diverse, a highly optimized algorithm for interstellar cargo routing that reduced transit times by nearly 30%, a revolutionary genetic sequencing technique for rare xenoflora, even a complex, multi-layered piece of sentient art that evoked profound emotional responses in several non-human species. These were not demands for help. They were offers of unique, valuable intellectual property. The internal Sol Loop network continued to hum, providing the material foundation for this audacious venture. While resources were still tight, the focus had shifted from mere survival to strategic output. Every scientific breakthrough, every innovative solution, every elegant algorithm developed within the Sol system was now viewed through the lens of its potential as an echo. Humanity was no longer merely a producer of goods. It was becoming a factory of ideas, a forge of pure intellectual capital. The K'tharr thought they had crippled our trade routes. Instead, they had inadvertently forced us to invent a whole new form of currency, one that their physical barriers were utterly incapable of blocking. The stage was set for the universe to witness humanity's most cunning workaround yet. The first few echoes were testaments to humanity's audacious gamble. Dr. Rostova's quantum coherent transmissions, meticulously crafted to carry abstract, high-value intellectual property, slipped through the K'tharr barrier like whispers through a storm. On the other side, across the vast expanse of stellar dust and nebulae, beyond the hegemony's watchful gaze, these echoes found their mark. Not in the K'tharr's centralized data nets, but in the private, often illicit, research networks of other species. The galactic underworld, a vibrant tapestry of independent traders, rogue scientists, and information brokers, was the unexpected recipient. The K'tharr Hegemony, in their rigid adherence to protocol and their belief in their own impenetrable security, had neglected to account for the universal constant of curiosity and the pervasive nature of information arbitrage. When an anonymous, untraceable data packet containing a revolutionary algorithm for optimizing gravitic field stability or a previously unknown solution to a complex astrophysical paradox suddenly appeared on a black market data exchange, it sent ripples through the scientific community. Initially, these alien recipients were wary. Where did these gifts come from? Who was behind them? There was no sender ID, no demand for payment, no overt political agenda attached, just pure, unadulterated intellectual capital, delivered with a precision that hinted at an advanced, yet unknown source. The value was undeniable. A new, more efficient method for terraforming arid worlds. A bioluminescent symbiotic organism that could clean space station atmospheres. A fractal compression algorithm that reduced data storage by orders of magnitude. These were not mere curiosities. They were game changers. The K'tharr, still observing the Sol system with their limited, biased sensors, continued to misinterpret the subtle energy fluctuations. They attributed the occasional focused bursts of quantum energy to humanity's ineffectual Attempts at barrier penetration, perhaps even scoffing at the primitive nature of our theoretical physics. Their focus remained on material assets, on physical blockades, on conventional warfare. They were looking for hammers and drills, while humanity was weaving tapestries of pure thought. It was a profound, strategic blind spot, born of an empire, too vast and too arrogant to conceive of such an unconventional form of economic warfare within the Sol system. The success of the Echoes fueled a new kind of industry. Ideation hubs sprang up on every major colony and orbital. These were not traditional research labs, but collaborative think tanks where humanity's brightest minds, previously constrained by resource scarcity or external market demands, were now unleashed. Engineers, artists, xenolinguists, mathematicians, and philosophers worked in tandem, brainstorming problems, devising elegant solutions, and encoding them into the precise quantum packets required for transmission. The goal was no longer merely to survive, but to innovate with a purpose, to create something so universally valuable, so utterly unique, that it transcended the physical blockade. The bartering mechanism was ingenious in its simplicity. No direct payment was ever requested. Instead, the Echoes served as a silent, ongoing demonstration of humanity's intellectual prowess. The expectation was that the recipients, having benefited immensely from these gifts, would, in turn, find ways to reciprocate, not with goods or direct credit transfers, but with specialized information, rare datasets, or even subtle political leverage that could indirectly benefit humanity. It was a trust-based, decentralized, and entirely abstract form of trade. We were giving away the keys to new galaxies of knowledge, trusting that the universe would, eventually, find a way to pay us back in kind. The K'tharr Hegemony locked in their antiquated understanding of galactic economics were not just missing the point. They were actively digging their own grave. They had attempted to starve humanity of resources, but instead, they had unwittingly forced us to become the galaxy's most prolific and advanced intellectual property purveyors. The quiet hum of ingenuity within the Sol system was not a sign of our decline, but the thrum of a new revolutionary engine spooling up. We weren't just finding a better way. We were inventing it, piece by abstract piece, right under their unseeing eyes. The seeds of a new galactic economic order. 1. Where information was king and ingenuity, the ultimate currency, were B. The subtle ripples created by humanity's echoes began to coalesce into distinct waves. These weren't just isolated incidents of intellectual property changing hands. They were becoming a nascent, entirely new form of galactic trade. The K'tharr Hegemony's blockade, designed to isolate and cripple, had inadvertently become a catalyst for this unprecedented economic evolution. Their conventional wisdom, rooted in millennia of controlling physical resources and established trade lanes, left them utterly blind to the paradigm shift occurring under their very noses. The first species to truly engage with humanity's echoes. On a systemic level were the Xylos, a highly advanced, silicon-based life form renowned for their hyper-efficient computational networks and their insatiable thirst for complex data. The K'tharr considered the Xylos a minor, if technologically, adept client species easily managed. But the Xylos, with their vast data processing capabilities, were the first to consistently decode the intricate quantum-entangled packets. Emanating from Sol, they recognized the value immediately, not just in the individual algorithms or theorems, but in the sheer boundless ingenuity they represented. The Xylos didn't just consume the echoes. They began to subtly reciprocate. Their reciprocation wasn't in the form of physical goods, for that would alert the K'tharr. Instead, they began transmitting their own echoes back towards the Sol system. Not through the K'tharr barrier directly, they lacked the precise quantum entanglement technology, but through highly encrypted, multi-layered data bursts, routed through the galactic darknet. These data bursts contained rare astronomical survey data, highly advanced theoretical physics models, and even refined methodologies for sustainable resource extraction that far surpassed humanity's current capabilities. They were paying in kind, with pure, unadulterated knowledge. This was the genesis of the ghost lanes, as humanity's xeno-economists dubbed them. Untraceable, encrypted information pathways that circumvented the K'tharr's physical blockade. The ghost lanes weren't actual hyperspace routes. They were conceptual, digital conduits built on trust and mutual intellectual benefit. Humanity would transmit an echo, a solution to a universal problem. The Xylos, or later, the highly decentralized K'tharr Ash Merchant Guilds, or even the enigmatic, reclusive Luminaflux Collective, would receive it, utilize it, and then transmit valuable, non-physical data back, carefully avoiding any trace of direct trade that could be detected by the hegemony. The K'tharr, meanwhile, were still stuck in their old models. Their intelligence reports likely noted the unusual surge in activity within the Xylos' research networks, or the sudden, inexplicable efficiency gains reported by certain K'tharr Ash asteroid mining operations. They probably attributed these to internal innovations or isolated breakthroughs, never suspecting a coordinated, abstract exchange with the very species they had imprisoned. Their arrogance was their blind spot. They believed they had isolated humanity, when in fact, they had forced humanity to become the nexus of an entirely new, invisible economic network. This new form of FTL barter via encrypted pulses was transforming humanity from a consumer into a primary producer of abstract value. Our unique, often chaotic, approach to problem solving, fettered by centuries of rigid galactic protocols, proved to be an unexpected asset. We were developing solutions that other species, bound by tradition or limited by specific resource dependencies, simply hadn't conceived of. What the K'tharr meant as punishment, economic isolation, had become the ultimate proving ground for human ingenuity. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving, building an empire of ideas, one quantum-entangled pulse at a time. The real victory wasn't breaking the blockade, but rendering it utterly irrelevant. The ghost lanes began to proliferate. What started as a clandestine exchange with the Xylos expanded, slowly but inexorably. Two other independent and semi-independent species within the hegemony's vast dominion. The K'tharr's strict control over physical trade routes had inadvertently created a vacuum, a desperate demand for innovation and specialized knowledge that their own rigid, bureaucratic system struggled to provide. Humanity, isolated and under duress, became the unlikely and unsung supplier. The K'tharr, nomadic bioengineers with a mastery of organic starship construction, found their designs radically improved by human echoes containing advanced structural optimization algorithms. The Vrel masters of deep space mining saw their extraction rates triple thanks to human-designed subterranean mapping protocols. Even the secretive, decentralized merchant guilds of the K'tharr Ash, long chafing under K'tharr trade tariffs, found new avenues of wealth through human-sourced cybernetic enhancements for their automated trade fleets. Humanity was, in essence, becoming the galaxy's premier intellectual property provider, a silent partner in countless alien advancements. The K'tharr hegemony, meanwhile, grew increasingly puzzled. Their economic models, once infallible, were showing peculiar anomalies. Certain sectors of their client species economies were experiencing sudden, unexplained surges in productivity and innovation. The Xylos were building more efficient computational arrays than ever before, despite no new K'tharr-sanctioned technology transfers. The K'tharr were launching bioships with unprecedented speeds without any direct input from hegemony shipyards. These anomalies were flagged, debated, and ultimately dismissed as either internal breakthroughs or, in some cases, attributed to unauthorized reverse engineering of minor K'tharr technologies. The very idea that a quarantined species, one they believed was teetering on the brink of collapse, could be the source of this widespread, stealthy economic boom was simply beyond their comprehension. Their analytical paradigms were too narrow, too focused on the physical. Humanity, however, was not simply giving away its intellectual capital. The ghost lanes operated on a sophisticated, trust-based system of reciprocal value. For every echo transmitted, humanity received something equally invaluable back through the encrypted channels. Sometimes it was highly specialized data on rare stellar phenomena, crucial for developing new power sources. Other times, it was advanced schematics for zero-G manufacturing, or even comprehensive linguistic databases for newly discovered species. This wasn't about accumulating wealth in the K'tharr sense. It was about accumulating knowledge, expanding our collective understanding, gaining strategic advantages that physical resources alone could not provide. The subtle, high-Q situational sarcasm within the Sol system was palpable. There were jokes about the K'tharr being the galaxy's most unwitting venture capitalists, funding humanity's intellectual revolution by attempting to stifle it, or how their impenetrable blockade was, in fact, the most effective barrier against their own intelligence gathering. The irony was delicious. They had created the perfect environment for humanity to flourish in a way they could never have predicted. By forcing us to innovate beyond their conventional understanding of trade, they had made us not just self-sufficient, but uniquely indispensable to the very galactic economy they sought to control. The Sol-Loop network, initially a desperate measure, had solidified into a robust internal economy, providing the material foundation for humanity's intellectual output. The ideation hubs worked ceaselessly, fueled by the knowledge flowing in from the ghost lanes and driven by a shared sense of defiant purpose. The K'tharr had intended to make humanity a cautionary tale. Instead, they were inadvertently turning us into a blueprint for a new, decentralized, and infinitely more adaptable galactic economic future. The stage was being set for a revelation that would shake the very foundations of the hegemonies long held. The K'tharr Hegemony. Despite their vast intelligence network and millennia of experience in galactic governance, were experiencing a slow, creeping unease. The anomalies they had initially dismissed were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming a pattern across their client species, particularly those with less direct oversight. There was a noticeable uptick in technological advancement, economic efficiency, and even a subtle shift in diplomatic confidence. The Xylos, for instance, were now challenging hegemony trade proposals with a newfound shrewdness, backed by computational insights that rivaled the K'tharr's own. The K'tharr, once content with their allocated stellar nurseries, were now developing bioships capable of traversing previously uncharted nebulae, opening up new, unauthorized resource frontiers. These independent advancements were a direct affront to the K'tharr's meticulously controlled galactic order. Their economic analysts, finally forced to acknowledge the systemic nature of these shifts, began to reevaluate their models. They still couldn't pinpoint the source. Their hypersensors reported the Sol system as quiet, isolated, economically inert. The faint quantum-coherent energy bursts were still classified as insignificant theoretical emissions. They were looking for a physical trade route, a smuggling operation, a breach in their barrier, and finding none. The possibility of an abstract, informational economy being conducted right under their noses was simply too outlandish, too alien to their worldview. Meanwhile, within the Sol system, humanity was perfecting its craft. The echoes were no longer just solutions to problems. They were proactive innovations designed to anticipate future galactic needs. We transmitted complex environmental remediation protocols, advanced neurological interface schematics, even revolutionary artistic algorithms that could generate hyperrealistic, emotionally resonant virtual experiences. The goal was to make humanity not just valuable, but utterly indispensable. We were building a reputation, not with fleets or credits, but with pure, unadulterated genius, The irony was not lost on the human collective. We were the caged animal, yet we were subtly shaping the ecosystem outside our cage. The K'tharr had intended to cut off our economic limbs. Instead, they had forced us to grow entirely new, invisible appendages that reached further and deeper than any physical trade route ever could. The constant banter among the ideation hubs reflected this triumph. Who needs a trade agreement when you can just send them the intellectual property for a better one? Or they think they're starving us, but we're just outsourcing their R&D. The feedback loop through the ghost lanes was becoming incredibly rich. As more species benefited from human echoes, more valuable information flowed back. Humanity gained access to exotic material compositions, advanced propulsion theories, and even insights into the K'tharr's own internal bureaucratic weaknesses. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about strategic advantage. We were learning, adapting, and growing stronger, all while ostensibly isolated. The K'tharr, in their growing frustration, began to tighten their internal controls, increasing surveillance on their client species, imposing harsher penalties for unauthorized technological development. They suspected internal dissent, perhaps a burgeoning alliance among their subjugated worlds. They were looking for a rebellion of swords and ships, completely oblivious to the far more insidious revolution of ideas that was quietly brewing. They saw the symptoms, but completely misdiagnosed the disease. The time was approaching for the K'tharr to face the true consequence of their arrogance. They had sown the seeds of humanity's innovation, and now the harvest was ready. The culmination of this silent economic war was not going to be a grand battle, but a profound, undeniable shift in galactic power dynamics, orchestrated by the very species they had sought to erase. The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place, setting the stage for the ultimate reveal of humanity's ingenious workaround. The K'tharr Hegemony's growing frustration morphed into a profound disquiet. Their internal intelligence reports, once focused on maintaining order, were now filled with unsettling data. Key client species, once compliant and predictable, were exhibiting alarming levels of economic independence. The Xylos had not only refused a K'tharr-mandated resource allocation treaty, citing superior internal optimization protocols, but had begun exporting their own highly advanced computational units to other K'tharr client species, subtly undercutting hegemony prices. The K'tharr were openly trading their organically grown starship components on the galactic open market. Components that boasted efficiency ratings previously thought impossible without K'tharr input. The hegemony's top strategists and economists, now fully alarmed, launched a full-scale investigation. They deployed advanced active hypersensor arrays, designed to detect any form of illicit trade, any unauthorized communication, any breach of their blockade. They combed the void around the Sol system for smuggling vessels, for rogue jump points, for anything that could explain the inexplicable surge in innovation, originating from the very species they had supposedly isolated. And they found ... nothing. The blockade was intact. The Sol system remained, by all physical metrics, a perfectly sealed prison. The K'tharr's analytical systems, however, began to flag the consistent, peculiar quantum coherent energy bursts emanating from Sol, previously dismissed as harmless theoretical physics experiments. These bursts were now being reevaluated in light of the economic anomalies. But even then, their conclusion was limited. Perhaps humanity was developing a new, highly efficient, but still internal form of energy production. They never for a moment considered that these bursts were the very fabric of an entirely new economy, a currency of pure information being exchanged right under their noses. Their conceptual framework simply didn't allow for it. Within the Sol system, humanity watched the K'tharr's increasingly frantic maneuvers with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The time for subtlety was drawing to a close. The Echoes had done their work. They had created a network of grateful, technologically empowered alien species. For the first time in millennia, saw an alternative to the K'tharr's rigid dominion. These species had benefited immensely from human ingenuity, and they understood implicitly the source of their newfound prosperity. The final phase of humanity's audacious plan was put into motion. It wasn't an attack, not a military offensive. It was a demonstration, a galactic-scale product launch, if you will. Working through the established ghost lanes, humanity began to transmit a singular, highly complex echo to every single species with whom they had established a connection, and even to some who had merely benefited indirectly from their transmitted innovations. This echo contained a fully realized, universally compatible open-source blueprint for a revolutionary new FTL drive. A drive that was not only significantly more efficient than anything the K'tharr possessed, but also far simpler to construct, requiring only commonly available materials. This was the ultimate mic drop. The K'tharr had denied humanity access to their trade routes, believing they held a monopoly on advanced technology and interstellar travel. Humanity was now giving away the keys to the universe, democratizing FTL travel in a single, audacious stroke. This wasn't about breaking the blockade. It was about making the concept of a blockade obsolete. The message encoded within the elegant lines of the FTL blueprint was clear. You thought you had us cornered. We just built our own highway, and now we're giving the map to everyone else. The stage was set for the grand unveiling, a revelation that would shatter the hegemony's economic and strategic dominance forever. The final triumphant act was about to begin. The galaxy held its breath, though it didn't know why. For the K'tharr Hegemony, the inexplicable surge in their client species' capabilities, combined with the continued infuriating silence from the supposedly crippled Sol system, had become an existential crisis. Their analysts were tearing apart their models. Their intelligence agencies were running countless simulations, all pointing to an impossible conclusion. Their iron grip on galactic trade and technology was inexplicably loosening. They still saw the Sol system as a cage, but the birds inside were somehow building wings for everyone else. Then came the FTL blueprint, not as a physical object, not as a diplomatic overture, but as a pure, undeniable burst of intellectual capital, transmitted across the ghost lanes to every species who had benefited from humanity's echoes. It was a revolutionary hyperdrive design, elegant in its simplicity, yet profoundly powerful in its implications. It didn't rely on rare, hegemony-controlled materials, nor did it require K'tharr-specific manufacturing techniques. It was open-source, universally compatible, and instantly superior to anything the hegemony had ever deigned to share. The impact was immediate and seismic. Across countless systems, independent engineers and rogue scientists, previously stifled by K'tharr technological monopolies, began to implement the blueprints. Shipyards that once struggled to maintain aging vessels suddenly found themselves fabricating components for drives that could traverse interstellar distances faster and more efficiently than ever before. New trade routes, entirely independent of K'tharr oversight, began to bloom. Previously isolated systems deemed unprofitable by the hegemony suddenly found themselves connected, their economies invigorated by newfound access to resources and markets. The K'tharr, through their active hypersensors, finally registered the shift, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a million tiny tremors. New, unfamiliar FTL signatures began appearing across the galactic map, not following established hegemony lanes, but blazing new paths through uncharted space. These were not the warp trails of their enemies, nor the signature of their own fleets. These were the trails of newly empowered species charting their own destinies. Their ships powered by human ingenuity, Panic erupted in the K'tharr High Command. Their blockade around Seoul, once a symbol of their absolute power, now stood as a monument to their profound miscalculation. They had tried to contain humanity, to starve us, to make us irrelevant. Instead, they had inadvertently forced us to become the architects of a new galactic economic order, one where information, not physical control, was the ultimate currency. They had thought to punish us with isolation. We had responded by making ourselves the most connected species in the galaxy, not through their networks, but through our own. The irony was exquisite, and the human collective savored it. The K'tharr had, in their arrogance, created the perfect conditions for humanity's most spectacular triumph. They wanted to block our trade routes. We had simply found a better way. A way that didn't just bypass their chokehold, but rendered it utterly meaningless. Within months, other species, inspired by humanity's audacious act, began to copy us. They started transmitting their own intellectual property, their unique innovations. Across the burgeoning ghost lanes, circumventing the hegemony's antiquated trade system. What the K'tharr meant as punishment. What they intended as our demise had become the blueprint for their undoing. Humanity, the caged animal, had not only escaped, but had shown every other caged creature how to pick the lock. The K'tharr Hegemony, once the undisputed masters of galactic commerce, now found themselves facing a decentralized, information-driven economy they couldn't control, couldn't understand, and couldn't block. Their empire, built on physical dominance and resource control, was slowly, irrevocably, becoming obsolete. Humanity hadn't just survived. We had innovated our way to becoming the unexpected, undisputed architects of the galaxy's economic future. And the best part? The K'tharr had paid for the research. The silence that now fell over the K'tharr hegemony was not one of control, but of dawning realization. The silence of an empire slowly fading into irrelevance. Outmaneuvered not by force, but by a species that dared to think differently. The universe had changed, and humanity, from within its prison, had quietly, brilliantly, led the revolution. The galaxy held its breath, though it didn't know why. For the K'tharr hegemony, the inexplicable surge in their client species' capabilities, combined with the continued infuriating silence from the supposedly crippled Sol system, had become an existential crisis. Their analysts were tearing apart their models. Their intelligence agencies were running countless simulations, all pointing to an impossible conclusion. Their iron grip on galactic trade and technology was inexplicably loosening. They still saw the Sol system as a cage, but the birds inside were somehow building wings for everyone else. Then came the FTL blueprint. Not as a physical object, not as a diplomatic overture, but as a pure, undeniable burst of intellectual capital, transmitted across the ghost lanes to every species who had benefited from humanity's echoes. It was a revolutionary hyperdrive design, elegant in its simplicity, yet profoundly powerful in its implications. It didn't rely on rare, hegemony-controlled materials, nor did it require K'tharr-specific manufacturing techniques. It was open source, universally compatible, and instantly superior to anything the hegemony had ever deigned to share. The impact was immediate and seismic. Across countless systems, independent engineers and rogue scientists, previously stifled by K'tharr technological monopolies, began to implement the blueprints. Shipyards that once struggled to maintain aging vessels suddenly found themselves fabricating components for drives that could traverse interstellar distances faster and more efficiently than ever before. New trade routes, entirely independent of K'tharr oversight, began to bloom. Previously isolated systems, deemed unprofitable by the hegemony, suddenly found themselves connected, their economies invigorated by newfound access to resources and markets. The K'tharr, through their active hypersensors, finally registered the shift, not as a single catastrophic event, but as a million tiny tremors. New, unfamiliar FTL signatures began appearing across the galactic map, not following established hegemony lanes, but blazing new paths through uncharted space. These were not the warp trails of their enemies, nor the signature of their own fleets. These were the trails of newly empowered species, charting their own destinies. Their ships, powered by human ingenuity, panic erupted in the K'tharr High Command. Their blockade around Sol, once a symbol of their absolute power, now stood as a monument to their profound miscalculation. They had tried to contain humanity, to starve us, to make us irrelevant. Instead, they had inadvertently forced us to become the architects of a new galactic economic order, one where information, not physical control, was the ultimate currency. They had thought to punish us with isolation. We had responded by making ourselves the most connected species in the galaxy, not through their networks, but through our own. The irony was exquisite, and the human collective savored it. The K'tharr had, in their arrogance, created the perfect conditions for humanity's most spectacular triumph. They wanted to block our trade routes. We had simply found a better way, a way that didn't just bypass their chokehold, but rendered it utterly meaningless. Within months, other species, inspired by humanity's audacious act, began to copy us. They started transmitting their own intellectual property, their unique innovations, across the burgeoning ghost lanes, circumventing the hegemony's antiquated trade system. What the K'tharr meant as punishment, what they intended as our demise, had become the blueprint for their undoing. Humanity, the caged animal, had not only escaped, but had shown every other caged creature how to pick the lock. The K'tharr Hegemony, once the undisputed masters of galactic commerce, now found themselves facing a decentralized, information-driven economy they couldn't control, couldn't understand, and couldn't block. Their empire, built on physical dominance and resource control, was slowly, irrevocably becoming obsolete. Humanity hadn't just survived. We had innovated our way to becoming the unexpected, undisputed architects of the galaxy's economic future. And the best part? The K'tharr had paid for the research. The silence that now fell over the K'tharr hegemony was not one of control, but of dawning realization. The silence of an empire, slowly fading into irrelevance, outmaneuvered not by force, but by a species that dared to think differently. The universe had changed, and humanity, from within its prison, had quietly, brilliantly led the revolution. The K'tharr, trapped in their millennial dogma of material dominion, found their grand oppressive edifice crumbling, not from a direct assault, but from a million invisible threads of innovation woven by the very species they sought to crush. Their vaunted blockade, once an impenetrable wall, had become a transparent curtain, allowing all but themselves to see the vast, new economic landscape beyond the galactic underworld. Once a fringe element, blossomed into a legitimate, if unconventional, parallel economy, all centered around the intellectual capital originating from the Sol system. Human echoes became the gold standard, coveted and reciprocated with an eagerness that dwarfed any physical transaction. New species emerged from obscurity, their growth fueled by human innovation, bypassing the hegemony's restrictive tariffs and monopolistic practices entirely. The K'tharr's once mighty trade fleets, designed for a bygone era of physical goods, now patrolled increasingly empty hyperspace lanes, their cargo bays underutilized, their profit margins evaporating. The ultimate irony was the K'tharr's desperate attempts to understand. Their top xenoeconomists were reassigned to study the Sol anomaly, poring over fragmented data, trying to reverse engineer the sudden explosion of efficiency and technology across their dominion. They theorized about clandestine rebel cells, about ancient, forgotten alien caches of technology, about solar flares causing unforeseen mutations in supply chains. They dispatched covert probes towards Sol, looking for any sign of a weakness. In their barrier, any crack through which humanity could have smuggled in resources. They never found one, because the goods were never physical. The blockade was, from a human perspective, perfect. It perfectly contained humanity, forcing us to transcend the very concept of physical trade. The smugness within the Sol system was no longer subtle. It was an undercurrent of quiet, collective triumph. Humanity had not merely endured. It had adapted, innovated, and fundamentally reshaped the galactic economy, all while locked away. The K'tharr Hegemony, in their colossal, calculated arrogance, had handed humanity the ultimate competitive advantage, the necessity of pure, unadulterated, unblockable ingenuity. They had inadvertently made us the galaxy's most coveted intellectual powerhouse, a silent engine of progress whose output was not tangible, but infinitely more valuable. The new galactic order was not built on their terms, but on ours. Forged in the crucible of their misplaced punishment, the galaxy now looked to Sol, not as a quarantined pariah, but as the wellspring of innovation, the quiet epicenter of a revolution. The K'tharr had thought to isolate a planet. Instead, they had isolated themselves, rendered obsolete by the very force they had unleashed. Their empire was not destroyed by a fleet, but by an idea transmitted at light speed, echoing through the ghost lanes of a universe they no longer controlled.